Hey y'all, my name is Basil. I'm one of the owners of Leaf and Limb. We're a tree care company and we care for trees because we love the planet. So our whole, as a company, what we really focus on is preservation, planting new trees, and then also just spreading awareness about the importance of trees. We love JCRA and Arboretum. We do a lot of work and sponsorship with this Arboretum. For me personally, it's part of my journey. I started coming here maybe 10 years ago as I was beginning to learn about plants. It's very helpful in my journey, helped me establish a deeper connection with trees, and I've personally really enjoyed a lot of the different events they do. So,
all right, do we have any questions? Yes. Okay. So, the comment was, we talked about leaves as mulch, leaving them down. There's reference to Leaf and Limb's pamphlet where they talk about the same thing. And we're lucky here in that we get NC State University's leaves dumped here for us. In fact, we've been able to barter some services with Leaf and Limb. We've provided them with some of those partially composted leaves, and they helped us haul some to our research site so we could use them to build the soil there. But then the question became, what do you do with those big, leathery, tough leaves from southern magnolias? There are other magnolias, you don't have to worry about that. I will pass this on, see if other people have ideas. What I say is, one, and this may be too late for you, never, ever, ever limb up a southern magnolia. Keep it all the way to the ground so the leaves just fall under it and you don't have to deal with them. Mm-hmm. Two, give one to your neighbor downwind and let them deal with it. That way you get the flowers, you get the beauty. It's perfect. Any other thoughts?
I have thoughts as well. Basil, go first. Go ahead.
I would just say also, this is one of those trees that drops leaves throughout the season. So it's not just a fall thing. They do break down, actually. It just takes a little longer. My best recommendation, if your tree's limbed up, which a lot of these magnolias are limbed up, but I definitely second, if it's not too late, never limb it up. But if it's too late, I would also recommend putting about 8 to 10 inches of arborist wood chips down as a base. And then you let those leaves just fall in and they will all rot and create a really nice, thick duff that also helps build a great soil profile.
Yeah.
And if you think about how trees in the forest work, they typically feed themselves, meaning they drop leaves, those leaves feed soil microorganisms, and trees will, there are billions of different kinds of organisms, so a tree is probably going to be feeding the sorts of organisms that it needs to be healthy. So those leaves are probably very good for the things that help create healthy magnolia root systems.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I do, yes, yeah, I can do that as well. So about the magnolia leaves, I have some in my yard. And I do two things with them. I create a tree ring of mulch around the magnolia and just keep kind of putting them back in that space and just kind of designating this is the Magnolia grandiflora area and not really dealing with it. The other thing I do with it, I run my lawnmower with the bag on it on the mulch setting. I put it up really high on the highest setting and I just run the lawnmower over it. And I actually take that, the leaves come out about something between that big, and I put it in my compost pile and just cover it with leaves and all sorts of other detritus. And it actually does break down for me. So designating an area and composting it is a pretty easy way to deal with it for the most part. Now, limbing up. So limbing up, if you think about a tree and just kind of the shape that it gets naturally, southern magnolias they almost look like shrubs. Their canopies go from the ground to the tip. But some people, for some reason, need to see the trunk of southern magnolias. So they take off those lower limbs. And what happens is you end up with this kind of junky looking area where the leaves fall. And a lot of people don't like it. For some reason, they feel the necessity to remove those leaves for some reason. And so then you kind of deal with this perpetual problem of, I've raked those leaves away. Why are they continuing to drop leaves in the same place? Just leave them there. If you really need to grow something underneath the southern magnolia, don't. Just don't. It's fine. It'll be fine. Plant something else somewhere else and just leave them there.
You can do containers under one.
There you go.
Like a grouping of containers if your tree is, branches have been lifted. But I want to follow up on something that that Basil mentioned. He said, put down, wood chips down there as a mulch. And there's been this long running misconception that fresh wood chips will rob all the nitrogen from the soil and kill your plants. That is not true. It's not true. Your plants are getting their nitrogen from the soil. Yes, those fresh wood chips will take some nitrogen to breaking down. They do use up some nitrogen, not enough to damage your trees and shrubs and things like that. It's not a problem. Now, if you go real deep with them, like we've said, you should not. They can get hot while they compost. Composting can get hot, and that can affect plants. But you got to go deep to do that. A mulch layer is not going to do that. But it is great to get those wood chips and other things. And there's a great YouTube video. If you haven't gone to our site, we've got a channel where all of our midweek programs, all of these talks will be on. There's a great one from another Gardening in the South program with a retired professor, Bill Fontenot, who talks about building soil. And you can you layer things kind of like that compost picture I said was junk, and in a relatively short time, really build some soil. So I always joke that I move my compost pile around. I put my compost pile there and I'll dump wood chips. I get chips dropped. There's an chip drop app that you can have companies like Basil and others bring their chips. And I will put my compost and I will pile chips on it and I'll put junk on it. And then I'll start another pile. And in, a year or two, I'll be like, great. Now I have a good planting bed. It works well. Go ahead.
Any concern with sawdust?
That's a good question.
Any concern with sawdust versus wood chips? Either one of y'all want to take this? Go ahead. We'll let the tree man.
I mean, just in general, wood chips are amazing because they contain all parts of a tree, typically. The leaves and your small twigs contain something like 75% of your nutrients, your amino acids, a lot of the really good stuff that trees want to help rebuild soil, therefore build tree health. So I generally like wood chips. The issue with sawdust is twofold. Sometimes it could be an unidentified wood substrate, like you don't want pallet or something like that. It could have a lot of chemical residual, but assuming it's tree, you're really just getting probably trunk wood. So you sort of have let's call it a monocrop of nutrients that you're feeding your tree or your shrub. And the other challenge there is just something called hydrophobia, meaning sawdust and some of the processed mulches like triple shred mulch just have a tendency to become waterproof over time. And that waterproof then prevents water from getting down, which is the antithesis of what we want. And also that's where you start to see your bird nest fungi and your artillery fungus, the stuff that people just really hate. So in general, I'm not a big fan of sawdust nor triple shred.
And a note on sawdust, a lot of times nursery people will add it to their medium mix as a way to hold moisture. But generally in the home landscape, it doesn't really have any kind of direct application. I know some people add it to their compost pile just kind of as an addition, but not actually actively using it in the landscape.
Yeah, and I would echo that. That's what I was going to say. I do some woodworking and I dump my sawdust in my compost pile, or if I'm being real lazy, I'll just throw it out. But I'm not using it as a mulch. It's just out there. But the other thing, if you get sawdust from somewhere, if it's pressure treated sawdust, you don't want that. That you can have some problems with that. Less so in recent years, but go ahead. So the question was about Japanese beetles and June bugs. About some of the hibiscus, the perennial hibiscus and knockout roses, and whether you can just cut them back after they have been kind of chewed on by insects. The hibiscus, yes, for sure. That's no problem. Knockout roses, once they're established, you can do that. It'll keep them smaller, but it will take them much longer to get back to flowering size. You'd probably be getting back to flowering about the time that we're getting frost with those. But if you give them kind of a light trim, and that actually will keep them in check, and that won't be. And you're really most of the foliage is on the outside on those, so you can do that and just trim them back. In a couple of weeks, they'll be flowering again. So the question was about some using landscape fabric and then mulching on top of it. Problem with that to keep weeds down, and it works in the short term. Landscape fabric, do not get plastic. For the love of God, don't get plastic. But the problem is you're mulching on top, leaves are going on top, you are building soil on top.
Right.
The weeds will come
Right.
and root into the top. And they'll root through that landscape fabric, and they get really hard to pull out.
Yes.
Um,
Fire ants love landscape fabric.
Fire ants
They
love landscape
love
fabric.
landscape fabric.
It is a short-term solution. People think it is a solution. It is not. It will cause more problems as time goes on. You really you deal with the weeds and they get going. I spray. We spray here. We like to not have to spray for weeds, but if you have a seed bank in the soil. There are weed seeds in there. There are those perennial weeds. If you are diligent and get rid of them early,
Yes.
with whatever, if you don't want to you can use straight, for the annual weeds anyway, straight white vinegar, distilled vinegar. You can spray that. Now it can acidify the soil some, which we already have acidic soils, but so can a lot of the chemicals. But we used to do that in a butterfly garden I managed. We would just, same price as Roundup. We figured out. We did the cost analysis and going to Costco and getting jugs of distilled vinegar and putting it in a backpack sprayer and spraying worked. But you knock them down, then you put on your layer of mulch, and yes, they will come back, and they will come back for a while. But once you get that weed seed bank kind of taken care of, and the other thing is you can put down a pre-emergent in spring and in winter. Early March, put it down, and then in early March, and then going into fall, and you get those summer and winter weed seeds. They germinate and then die, but it takes a little while. But you can do a short-term solution that is not a long-term solution, or deal with it.
Because it is.
Yes. You
I
should.
would, yeah.
It is. I'm sorry. I'm gonna have a comment on this because I've been out to people's landscapes both already as an extension agent. I've been an extension agent for 4 weeks, y'all. I've been in a lot of places, but I've been in horticulture for about 10 years. And I've been to a lot of places. I've seen a lot of dying plants, and especially in commercially managed landscapes or commercially inherited landscapes. And a lot of them, the dead or dying trees, have been wrapped with landscape fabric because somebody installed them. They got the plants in, they covered all the soil with landscape fabric and left it. And I've even seen some where they've tucked the landscape fabric up against the plant, like they're tucking it into bed. And what happens is you're creating a weed barrier, but it's harder for water to get through. It's harder for water to get out. It makes the soil hotter, and you don't want hot soil. It's already hot enough as it is. And that air exchange between the soil profile and the atmosphere is super important. There's stuff living and breathing. And by putting that fabric on there, you're suffocating them. So you're not cultivating a good, healthy soil ecosystem. And then what eventually happens is you get rotten plants, you get heat-stressed plants, you get plants that kind of like stay still, which for some reason, like commercial landscapes, they just love plants that don't move and grow. They just want it to be like as it is when it's installed. And that looks great until it's dead. And it's usually when we have a lot of drought, or we have a lot of drought and then a lot of rain. It's usually when it rains that they already start kind of declining. And it's such a hassle to pull up. They put landscape tags in it. I just pulled up a bunch of landscape fabric where I'm gardening. I will not actually name the building that I pulled it out of. There was this much material under there. My hands were eaten up with fire ants as I was trying to pull that out. And I made a mess in the parking lot, like just trying to get this landscape fabric out. And it had killed an elm tree. It had killed a 15-foot tall elm tree. For some forsaken reason, they thought, I'm going to landscape fabric this and put a bunch of heavy chip on it, and killed a 15-foot tall Ulmus parviflora of all things, which is a tough freaking tree. So there's no love lost. Sorry.
I want to jump in
off.
quickly. I know I'm the tree guy, but I'm a super avid gardener. I've been doing it for a while. I love the vinegar solution, but also something to think about is density of planting. I would really recommend like thinking about trying to plant whole communities versus individual plants. Sort of my gardening career has actually taken me, I first had this, like, I don't want to mow anymore. So I started planting trees and flowers and stuff. And then I realized, wait a second, I don't want to weed anymore either. And I got into what are called like high density planting. So I do thickets, mini forests, and what are called Piedmont prairies. And these are managing whole communities of plants versus individual plants. And I don't want to do a shameless plug for Leaf and Limb. I'm going to do it. But next month, we're releasing a new service called Piedmont Prairies. And there's a really cool set of articles we have coming out. So if you want to join our newsletter, like you can see my whole narrative on how we got here. And it goes a lot into that whole concept.
Sweet.
Oh yeah, it'll kill the plants that are in the garden.
Really careful about where she's going.
Weeds and plants are the same thing. There are some that will kill grasses and not broadleaf weeds, and some that'll kill broadleaf weeds and not grasses. But otherwise, yeah, they kill it all. And I actually took a slide out of my talk. So same thing as what Basil's talking about is I do it, but with individual plants. Talked about the mulch. What I say, you want mulch to keep sun from hitting the soil surface where the weed seeds are. If you have plants covering the soil surface, blocking sun, they'll do the same thing. Now, herbaceous plants that die in the winter, you can still have winter weed issues and things like that. But the more the soil is covered, the better off you'll be. And it can be these native plant communities, which are, everybody talks about sustainable and nobody knows what it means. What we kind of try to think more about is resilient.
Yeah.
And that's where building the soil builds resiliency. But these communities, like a Piedmont prairie, you can have some bad year that really affects plants, and it can damage the Piedmont prairie. It's not a foolproof type of thing, but it's resilient. It fixes itself, and that's what you want in a landscape. We had a question. Go ahead. Well, okay, that's, percentages. Are you an engineer or something? Well, you type A, what percent? So the question was, you got this clay. If you have 3 inches before you hit the clay, you have great soil. And it holds water. And the question was, what kind of percentages do you need? And there is no magic formula. And you say that the clay blocks the plant's rooting. So in your clay, there's nothing growing in that clay. Your tree, now I'm not talking about the plants you're putting in. There's other things growing, right? Grass. Things will grow through that clay. What I tell people, if you're amending clay and if you're amending a new bed, or you have a lot of open space, go through, till as deep as you can. Put on a layer of compost, not too deep, or a layer of a mixed soil. You can get a mixed that's got some mineral soil and organic matter, and you till that in. And then you can go on top of that with more of that kind of mix if you want to really raise it up. But the reason you want to do that is you want that profile from the high organic to the clay. You don't want to just lay it on top. At least till in some compost before you go really deep. But it's all about tilling in as deep as you can if you're doing that. But I plant in that heavy clay in my woodland. And as long as I'm doing small plants, I just don't have problems, and plants root in and really start growing pretty quickly. I'll water them. Really, I just water them one time. I have access to plants, so it helps.
I've got 2 things to add to that. So I was talking to somebody earlier, and if for all of the new gardeners out there, building soil takes time. Like, please be patient with yourself. Just because you do all this amendment, because you add organic matter to your soil and you've tilled it up 50% and you've done this wonderful thing. It's a great strategy, by the way, that Mark just explained. But just because that year or the next year or even the next year doesn't wow your socks off, be patient. We have done a lot of terrible things to soil over the last 50 years. And we're the royal we of like the conservation community, the plant community, the agriculture community. We're now kind of starting to try and raise awareness about soil conservation. It takes a long time to build soil, to build an organic layer, for soil to have been what it is at this point in time. And by growing things in rows, by keeping cattle or forage on it, by putting houses in, we change that soil structure, we change that soil profile, we change it chemically by excluding or including certain things. There's a whole web of things that happen, but if you want to grow a garden, it is a labor of love and patience. And so be patient with yourself. All the things that we have told you today that we have that's in the leaf and limb flyer that Mark has just told you, it just takes time. And just because it's not that instant gratification, you are doing it right, and you will see the dividends in the future. So just take that to heart and think about it as you're like really cursing yourself, at the end, like in August, when you're like, oh my gosh, one more thing of mulch I've got to put out. It's really, it pays itself in the future. The other thing about topsoil and clay, I learned this from Dr. Fontenot. So Sanford is the brick city. There's a huge brick works in Chatham County, if you've ever gone down US 1. Clay, the native peoples, the indigenous peoples of Eastern North America have been making pottery out of this clay for thousands of years. But what makes bricks? Clay and sand. And if I do not add sand to your clay to increase the drainage, you are going to make the most beautiful terracotta block in the ground, and your plant, whatever it is not going to like it. So when you are, assessing your purchasing materials to add to your soil, really do that soil test. It's free. You can get as many boxes as you want. Do it. And all the resources for taking soil sampling is free on the internet. If you go to the Wake County, Chatham County, Harnett County, Johnson County, Lee County, we have people who will walk. You can walk in the office and we'll tell you how to do it. Just do it. Take the time. It takes about a week or two. It's worth the wait. Then go to your landscape supply company and say, I want to see what your topsoil looks like. Look at it. Feel it. If it's really heavy in sand, okay, definitely add a lot more organic matter. If you're going to put that in your clay, just make sure you are not adding a really sandy soil to your clay mix without amending it with a lot of compost material. So please don't create a terracotta pot. Just don't do it. Okay.
I want to add my perspective too, which is the laziest gardener possible. So one of the things to consider is that plants are the original tool for creating healthy soil. They capture sun, they push out sugar in the ground, and it feeds living things, and the living things reproduce, and that is the basis for soil. So you can use plants as a tool to create your healthy soil for you. Mm-hmm. And the way you do that is you find species that will do well in dry and hot conditions, and they're typically going to be early succession species. So like if it's a flower, goldenrod, or sneezeweed. If it's a tree, you're going to be looking more like pine and poplar. But there are plants you can actually plant that are early succession species or that do well in hot conditions. They'll go down, they'll get their roots in there, they'll start creating healthy soil for you. Mm-hmm. So I would encourage you to be as lazy as possible.
And we're going to see if there are questions online, but I do want to put a plug since it was mentioned that Sanford is the big brick works. Should mention that Ruby McSwain, we're for those at home, we are in the yes. Ruby McSwain Education Center. That is where the McSwains made their money and really have given back and still give back through their foundation to support the community.
Me in my job. I am paid by the McSwain Foundation.
And to support us both with this building, but they've also, their foundation is helping fund us integrating a little bit more, the technology a little bit more into this room so that we don't have the mess that y'all at home can't see that is allowing us to bring this to you. Blake, are there any questions online that we should answer?
I can't use a mic because I know we got it set
Well, I'll
Look, they're right here. When is the best time to move perennial hibiscus? In April.
in April. I don't have any
May.
time in April. April, May, great. You can do it in the fall. I am being serious. Last weekend, I moved 200 plants out of unamended soil to different spots in my garden because I'm redoing a part of my garden. Now, it's a relatively new garden, and I plant small, so it was, none of the shrubs were more than 3 feet by 3 feet. The perennials were small. I was digging up bulbs and moving them. I had a couple of trees that were maybe, I'm saying 6 feet because in my head I'm 6 feet tall. And even I've moved one that's about 12 feet tall. And I am watering some of those things a little bit more. But I moved them either after we got a good rain or I put a sprinkler on there. I set it on a timer to come on at about 3 a.m. and let it go for about 4 hours. And I had the soil just really, really, and the plants had given them enough time to really take up that water. And so they were full and turgid. So when I moved them and watered them in, they're not stressed going in. So you can and perennial hibiscus that is a tough plant. You're not going to kill it by moving it.
Let me asterisk. So I just say April, May. That's kind of as early. I don't like to move tropical-ish things in the wintertime. You can probably get away with it here in the South, but usually from April until October is really the best thing. It just gives them some time to establish. And if I was going to move it in October or even November, because we don't get that late frost until November, I'd just mulch it a little bit more. And if your hibiscus is just super huge and you want to move it, you can pull sticks out of it and just root the stem pieces. Sometimes you just don't even have to move the thing, just root a piece. Oh man, this one's aimed at me, so I'm so sorry, everybody. I mentioned the lace cap hydrangeas can be a bit tricky. Can I elaborate on that? I could, and they're not necessarily tricky. Trust me, their extension, NCSU extension, has written tons and tons of papers specifically on hydrangea macrophylla, hydrangea serrata, and really they are pretty bulletproof. What we usually get though, especially this time of year, they can get leaf spot diseases. Sometimes people don't prune them at the right time. So why are my plants not flowering? Sometimes they can look a little droopy if you've planted in a dry spot and we've gone through a dry spell. So they're a little bit more finicky, but if you use the basic gardening concepts that we've taught you here, mulch, siting things well, applying some fertilizer, they're really actually pretty tolerant.
Yeah, they're
it's 11:45,
tough.
Everybody.
As long as you don't, as long as you once it's established, they're tough. You can go find houses out, where the house is not there anymore, and you can see the forsythia and the hydrangea and the daffodil still there. I want to mention, we are answering questions. You will not offend us at all if anybody gets up and leaves during this time if you don't want to hear everything we're saying. So don't worry about that. Yeah. There was a question about somebody who bought a hardy oleander, Nerium oleander, and it hasn't flowered yet. Sometimes it takes a little while for things to get going. Oleander grows naturally in very, very infertile soils. It grows in sandy places. It grows in waste places. So one of the problems could be that it is actually too rich, too moist, and it is doing all of its vegetative green growth and not going into flowers. I would think it would flower next year. If it doesn't flower next year, rip it out. Be careful. Oleander is incredibly toxic. People get sick and sometimes die because they have nice straight stems and they grow at the beach and people roast hot dogs and marshmallows on there. So be careful. Be careful if you're pruning your oleander, wear a mask because the dust can be a problem.
Mm-hmm. Another note on that, we actually struggled to get the ones at JLBG to flower consistently. And I think some of that also might be that if it gets just a little bit too cold or just not hot enough, I think there's some relationship between temperature and climate and flowering.
Go ahead. So question was a bad infestation of spider mites. I think Basil has an answer. I will say a couple things. One, spider mites love the heat and humidity. Numbers can just go insane. But water, going out with a high pressure water hose and just blasting them. Once you get them out of the plant, it's like climbing Everest on your knees for a mite to crawl back up there. But the damage will still be there. You'll still see it. I really hate miticides. The mites and spiders are closer to us, believe it or not, than insects. And so when you start getting into miticides, they're more toxic. When you get into fungicides, believe it or not, fungi are closer to us than insects, and fungicides can be nasty. I do not spray fungicides. You can use sulfur, but I'm really careful when it comes to miticides. I think Basil has a solution for you.
And make sure you're always reading the label. If you have to apply something, there is a label on there for a legal reason. Read it.
There are some exceptions to this next statement, such as like invasive pests, but typically when you see a ton of aphids or mites, something's probably out of balance. I'm guessing we see this a lot when neighbors are doing mosquito sprays or when there's been a lot of pesticides nearby, because what happens is the ladybirds and other predatory insects suffer most from insecticides and mosquito sprays, and then the mites and the aphids come back very quickly and they don't have predators built in anymore. So there's an explosion of the population. So there's potentially an overabundance of chemical use somewhere nearby.
Yep.
Yeah, one of the more interesting examples of this that probably a lot of you who garden have seen is aphids on butterfly weed and milkweed.
Yep.
They get these bright orange aphids. And you can see them. They can look really bad or they can look really pretty depending on your viewpoint. It's all about viewpoint. But you notice they don't hurt the plant. The plant's just fine, right? Mm-hmm. Well, we know that we have monarchs who are laying eggs on there. We have the lady beetles, ladybugs. Their larvae love aphids and other insects, and so you're creating this healthy plate. You got the pollinator for the monarchs. You got the foliage on areas feeds the monarchs' larvae, the caterpillars, and then these aphids are there, which attract the ladybirds to lay their eggs on there. So their larvae are on there, so they're eating there, and it's a natural system. It's when, as Basil said, the system gets out of whack, and we're always trying to get the system out of whack. That's what humans do. So if we relax in our gardening a little bit more and try to mimic nature, whether that's with actual natural native things or just kind of mimicking how nature works, you can get things in whack. And there are some years where, for whatever reason, temperature at a certain time over the winter, rainfall, whatever, something gets out of whack naturally. But generally, if things have been going well and nothing has changed, like your neighbors aren't calling Mosquito Joe over to spray, generally the next year things will settle back into a kind of the natural rhythm. Oh man, I am gardening now on a woodland slope. It's not full sun, woodland slope. I am having success with plants I have never had success with. Now I'm all about, I'm making slopes everywhere, berm slopes. Plants love that. Now, when you're planting, you want the plant going up straight. So you kind of, you set it in there and it's a little harder to figure out what's level for the plant. You do a little lower on the back side, a little higher on the front side. And with things like that, you want to water slow. What I'll do is I'll go plant a bunch, and then I like to water things in, like I said, with a hose to really settle thing. I'll go through and water a little bit on everything, make sure the soil's really nice and wet, because that way the water won't run off. And then I go back and I'll water longer. And on the slope, I'll usually, right after planting, I'll water everything several times, kind of going back and forth to them so that they're really getting inundated. And then after that, sprinkler.
There's some really good diagrams on the Cooperative Extension's website. If you just Google that, they actually have like, these are kind of how your berm should look, and this is kind of how to think through planting on a slope, both just individual trees or individual beds, as well as there's some good diagrams for kind of building up actual terraces.
And slopes are one of those areas where, as Basil was talking about, covering the ground also helps you with
Soil
erosion
conservation.
and things like that. That can be really, really helpful. Yeah. Oh, we got the expert right here. He's come in and done trainings with his team here, and we put our interns with him to learn.
It all depends on your goals, first and foremost. Oh, sorry. Yes, of course. The question is about how to prune crepe myrtles. And I think first and foremost, it starts with your goals. A lot of people like to top crepe myrtles, which I would not recommend because it's generally unhealthy for the plant. But the underlying motivation for that is often because the tree is too big or it's encroaching. And one of the things I encourage people to think about in that situation is just whether or not that is the right tree for that spot. If you're having to continually top it to keep it smaller or contained within a space, it just might not be the right plant. Now, if it's an open area with lots of room to grow and there really are no constraints, there's no reason to cut it per se. Maybe you want to do some aesthetic pruning. Of course, there's some things you can do with raising canopy and thinning out. Maybe you want to take out the dead branches just for aesthetics also, but there's absolutely no reason to top it. That's just a trend that started sort of like the mulch volcanoes.
Yep.
I love that answer because most people in the plant world will say, "Crepe myrtle, oh my goodness, it's the worst thing, people topping trees." And, I have come around on this and said, why do I care? If you want to whack off the top of your tree, it does, it can cause problems. It is not healthy for the tree to whack it off. I'm not going to try and get Blake to pull it up, but one of the last slides I showed where I was talking about clipped hedges, that's from Elizabethan Gardens on the coast, on Manio here in North Carolina. If you look at the trees there, these are all crepe myrtles.
Yes.
And they have been done what is called pollarding. Pollarding is is topping really, but it's an intentional way of doing it. It's an aesthetic. It looks better. Well, it looks better in the winter. In the summer, you still get thin, wispy branches. A lot of times people will top their crepe myrtles because they see their neighbors do it, but also they say they get better flowers. You can get bigger flowers, but you get weaker stems that flop over when it rains. And it looks ugly during the winter when you take off the leaves. But, if it makes you happy, what do I care? I'm all about people being happy in their own gardens.
Yeah.
If I think it's ugly, then hey, that's on me.
There's some really good resources on Extension's website. Barb Fair actually has a nice article about proper techniques for pollarding, because there's actually a certain type of tissue you're going for when you properly pollard them. You're always taking that growth back to the same point. And what happens physiologically, it's kind of like the tree goes, okay, I'm going to create a different type of tissue here to kind of always kind of anticipate in a way that you're going to do this. And by doing that, you can kind of control that growth.
I do want to emphasize that it's bad for the tree.
Yeah, it is not healthy for the tree.
Yeah.
Well, and I'll add to that, when you do proper pollarding, it is different because the tree reacts different. And if you go to Europe and you see those big bosques, big parks where they have all these trees that are all the same height, and those trees are often, many, many decades, 100 years old, but that is a very specific thing. And it's because the tree changes its behavior. I don't know if that's
Physiology.
Physiology. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna give this to Basil, but just to repeat it, townhouse, big old 40-year-old. Oh God, is that right? 1982. 82 is 40 years ago.
Yeah.
40-year-old crepe myrtle starting to affect the foundation. Can something be done?
Yeah, there's a lot to do with roots and foundations, and I really need to actually do a presentation on this at some point because there's just so much to talk about. But I think the really important thing to understand is that typically plants do not have punching power in their root systems. So they don't typically cause the issue with pipes or or foundations. Morton Arboretum did some really cool research on this, and they estimate that something like 90% of intrusions with plant roots was not caused by the plant. They just get caught holding the bag, because you consider the following. A pipe is been laid in the ground, and if it's not done well, the micro vibrations in the earth can actually break a PVC pipe over time. So now the PVC pipe is maybe leaking some water. The roots sense the water, they want water, so they grow towards it. Now they're inside the pipe. The plumber comes and looks, and he says, oh, correlation is causation. It's the plant that did it, but it's not. The plant's just there because there's water.
Yep.
And that often happens a lot with foundations as well. My best recommendation is actually to have a plumber come in, remove the pipe, just snip the roots that are in the pipe, and lay a new pipe. That can be done potentially, depends on how deep it is. If it's deep, we have air tools that we can open up pockets for the plumbers to come and work. This sounds like you probably need a little bit of a consultation perhaps on site with somebody who knows trees.
You will almost never hear an arborist say that. They will say, you got to remove it. Trees break the foundations. That's not true. Trees aren't intelligent, so they can't change their behavior. They can change their physiology. As I was saying,
it's true.
they're sending roots out everywhere. Mm-hmm. If they come across an area where there's regular water, they proliferate.
Yep.
And so then they they get into the pipe, they clog it, they do that thing. Now, over time, as we see with sidewalks, they do get bigger, and you can sometimes have problems that way, but they really have to have access. They don't grow through, cinder block. And they generally, under foundations, if the foundation's done correctly, it is packed. You think digging in dry red clay is difficult? Where it's been done well, the tree just can't get under there. There's no airspace, and trees need, in the soil, they need air and water. The typical ideal is 50% solid matter, 25% air, 25% water. But, the question is, does leaf and limb go outside Wake County, and how far do they serve?
About 30 miles as the crow flies from here. Hopefully you know what that means. It's like Wake County, Orange County, Durham County. It's all of the triangle and its surrounding cities.
There's a project to come up with a group, figure out who the other arborists are that are thinking this way, and help influence them and create a network for people like ISA, the International Society for Arboriculture, but for people who are thinking about trees in a different way. All right.
Yeah, it's already there. It's
Short
already in
answer and
Apex,
long
don't worry.
answer. It's noon, so if people want to leave, because this may take a while. No, the privet, this is one where this is a very difficult plant to get rid of. You can get somebody to come in and rip out as much of it as you can. It won't all come out there, and then there's, start using some stump killing products to kill it off. Once it's gone, it's got a great big old seed and a fruit. So it's not a plant that will persist for a long time, the seed in the landscape. So once you get rid of the big one, you've gotten rid of 95% of the problem. You kill off the small ones and, spray them, because if you've tried to pull a little tiny seedling privet, holy cow. There are some things like weed wrenches, which is a big old heavy metal tool that'll pull it out. But get somebody to take it out. That helps. But here's what I want to say about, and privet's a great example. And this goes back to something that Basil said about dealing with the cause versus the symptom. The number one top correlation between invasive plants in natural areas, the top correlating factor is fertility. That fertility, it's always higher where you have the most problems with invasive plants in the wild. Where's that fertility coming from? Your yards. It's coming from ChemLawn. It's coming from these places that come and spray and put down way too much fertilizer. They get paid for that fertilizer they put down. You're paying them. And that runs off non-point source pollution. And that is the single biggest correlating factor. Now, people look at it and say, plant's bad. The plant's bad. It's in the wild. It's bad. It's not that it's the plant. That's the symptom. Now, we don't want that plant there, but we have to deal with the other underlying causes. And if we concentrate on the plant, it's like trying to deal with the pest and not the other areas. So it's plants get all the rap because they see them, they flower, things like that. We also have to be careful when we talk about invasive plants when we're looking at places that like roadsides that are being mowed every month that are not natural areas. And then you get these quick successional weeds, but they can't survive in the forest. It is 12 o'clock. We are going to wrap it up here. Your extension agent, whether you're in Lee County or anywhere else, is always happy to answer questions. Leaf and Limb is fantastic. If you have an issue, have them come out. It is well worth it because they are going to try and work with you to find a solution, not cut down your tree. In fact, I think if you insist on cutting down the tree, they'll send you down the road to somebody else, most likely. Politely. And we're always here at the Arboretum. We hope you come back and visit us often and come to some of our other education programs. Please fill out the survey at home and online. Thank you again to Amanda. Thank you again to Basil and Leaf and Limb.